Thank you for rejoining us. Now for some fast history. 10 years of the Glenkens Story in 10 minutes. Fasten your safety belts. In March 2015, some local people with an interest in our history decided to set up a group for the Glenkens. The Glenkens Story, with the motto Sharing Our History, aimed to tap into expert knowledge from near and far. GCAT gave it its backing to the initiative. To test the water, we organised a drop-in session on the community centre in Dalry. Some 120 local people dropped in to the afternoon and evening events. Local enthusiasts staged displays on their subjects, and a series of mini-lectures were delivered on topics from war memorials to place names, folklore to Covenanters. Pictured on the left in the foreground is Bill Blythe, local farmer and self-taught historian, displaying some of his vast collection of books and documents. In discussion there with Ted Cowan, our distinguished local professor of Scottish history, and Anna Campbell of the Carstfern Heritage Group, who was generous in her advice and support for our launch. Sadly, Bill and Ted are no longer with us, and I'm pleased to welcome Bill's widow, Mary, here today. We're very pleased to have you with us today. And later in the programme, we'll be hearing more of Ted's legacy from his widow and fellow historian, Lizanne Henderson. On the picture on the right, in the green jersey, is Avril Bridgman. She was one of many stallholders on the day, collecting information, in her case, for the New Galloway Shop project, which is now part of the New Galloway Story. We have spin-offs. Encouraged by the public response, we organised our first event at Catstrand. The talk by the authors of the book and radio series on the little-known lowland clearances, which affected more people than the Highland clearances, our talk sold out. Ticketless history fans were actually turned away. If this was news, what followed was even better. Discovering that this key historical text was out of print and that the publishers were refusing to reprint it, Alistair Livingston and Lucy Brown launched a successful campaign for a second edition. This brought our fledgling group national media headlines. Later, the authors thanked what they called the Glenkens radicals, we like that, for shaking up the Central Belt publishers. Alistair also, sadly, is no longer with us, and we will return to his contribution shortly. Field trips featured prominently in our early programs. Anna Campbell led our first trip to the disused lead mines above Carstfern and the ruins of a once thriving community in the hills. County archaeologist Andrew Nicholson, in the foreground on the left, led us on the old route over Bardennoch Hill out of Carstfern, taking in sites dating from the prehistoric through medieval times up to the early modern period. Andrew is showing the party one of the carved stone crosses which guided pilgrims. Here we have it in more detail, guided pilgrims to St Ninian's shrine at Whithorn. On the way, we discussed with local foresters the impact of new woodland on ancient sites. War memorials are a rich source of social and family history and show the impact of world affairs on local communities. Paul Goodwin led several field trips, including this one to Kells Kirkyard on the left, which is a very unusual feature. Against the wall there, next to this white tombstone, is an original wooden cross relocated from a First World War battlefield. There are only about 4 in Britain. We have one up the road in Kells. The other picture, of course, is the Balmaclellan Memorial, a very beautiful site with its view over the Rins of Kells. Civil War afflicted the Glenkens when Covenanters fought for religious freedom against the Stuart kings. David Bartholomew led a number of trips to sites of persecution and worship. On the left, our intrepid members explored a reputed Covenanter hiding place on the Blackwater. And on the right is the Holy Lynn. You can see David down in the right-hand corner describing how this was a place of secret conventicles and baptisms. In November 1666, a Covenanting army marching on Edinburgh was slaughtered by the government troops in the Pentland Hills outside the capital at Rowland Green. It is wrongly known in history as the Pentland Rising. It actually started in the Glenkens. It started in Dalry. It was our rising. On the 350th anniversary, David gave a detailed description of the start of the rising, followed by Ted Cowan, pictured here, who went on to discuss the national and indeed the international significance of what he called the most important historical event in the Glenkens. The talks in Dalry Kirk attracted one of our largest audiences, including a resident of the actual building which once housed the tavern where the conflict between Covenanters and government troops first erupted. A very real sense of sharing our local history prevailed at that day. Michael, you're on now.
Don't clap too soon, he's coming back. Yes, field trips, this is another one. This sylvan scene here is at the site of one of the lost farmsteads up the valley of the Blackwater of Dee. This is at Gairloch. And we visited several such farms up that valley. Incredible to think how populated it was at one time, and now just ghostly remains like this. And that was an accident. Local field and place names are crucial to our understanding of the Glenkens and its history. Talks on the subject have illustrated the variety of languages spoken in the area, while most of the field names in this image... Most of the field names in this image are Scots. The majority of local place names are of Gaelic origin. To illustrate the point, here we have a few local signs, and I'll say what they are in Gaelic from top left to bottom right. An lag uanje, achach agus ari, croch grey, fian tulach, Cowan na herave, and dal talachan. Agus marsin ha Gaelic has bio fug na skira, agus hug sin good don dulchas halachje sin, and an colars da vilas och giag. And what I was saying there was that we're at a conference, Galloway, the lost province of Gaelic Scotland. And here are the speakers at that conference. Top-notch academics, all typical of the presenters we've actually been able to attract to the Cat Strand for these proceedings. And we've had another example of that today with Adrienne. This conference itself led to the publication of a book, he said modestly, to wide academic acclaim. Sadly, as has been mentioned by Mike earlier, the respected local historian, Alistair Livingston, that's him in the middle there, behind the book, standing in the centre, he died just a few weeks after the conference, so this was his last real event. But we didn't just speak about Gaelic. The good broad Scots was gaire hearing his wheel. And here we are in a wee blether at the hen end of the Galloway Scots Conference in 2019. And that's Cubby McCubbin hodding forth on the Gan buddies, with Robin Jerdon hanging by and Ted Cowan looking just a wee bit dumbfoonert about the Hail Fankle. And as was mentioned by Mike or Adrian earlier, we had this other conference which Adrian was present at, it's him on the far right, which attempted to span 10,000 years of history in the one afternoon from the Mesolithic to 1000 AD. And one of the contributors, Richard Tipping's paper, has already been published in the Transactions of the Dumfries and Galloway Natural History and Antiquarian Society. That was on changing climate, environment, and people in Galloway. And I warned you, here he is back again.
Like a pantomime here. The River Ken defines the Glenkens, and its bridges have been vital to the community. The bicentenary of John Rennie's 5-arch granite masterpiece in 2022 was celebrated by numerous events, including an afternoon of talks by the Glenkens Story, as well as children's entertainments, the floodlighting of the bridge, and a musical creation by Wendy Stewart and the Galloway Agreement, premiered memorably under the bridge in a storm. Most recently, we had a conference celebrating the history of music making in Galloway, with a particular focus on the Glenkens. Rural Galloway had a thriving musical tradition at the heart of communities before the impact of mass media. Joe Miller, Anna Campbell, and Chris Wright explored the musical archives and told the stories of those who played and discovered. Particularly interesting, I found, the amount of discovery that had been going on. And this is ongoing, as we'll hear from Joe shortly. And of course, as we've been hearing, we've had a major historical discovery unfolding on our doorstep. Thanks to David Bartholomew and his contacts, we have had regular updates on the contents and preservation of this treasure trove. And more. Our talks have been wide-ranging. We've had some 30 talks, conferences, seminars, and field trips. And that was 2 years out, thanks to COVID. The late Alistair Livingston, with a challenging exposition on the subject he'd made his own, the Galloway Levellers. The Galloway nag, humble progenitor of horse breeding worldwide, which mysteriously disappeared. The Galloway cotton kings, who shaped the Manchester textile trade and kindly brought home their fortune. And Lizanne Henderson, speaking on the dangerous times of the witch hunts in the Stewartry, to name just 4. So what next? We started with a steering group of around. Some of them we have lost through death. Others have moved away or taken up other interests. We have no shortage of ideas, and Michael will be back to reveal some of them later. But what happens next will depend on who, if anyone, turns up at our next meeting. Without more people to help organize, nothing more will happen. There is a sign-up sheet on the piano at the door as you leave, and please put this date in your diary, and we will be circulating it, and we want to get as many people as possible who can help carry this forward. I hope you feel it's worth the effort. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mike. I'd now like to lead into the next session, which is Dr. Lizanne Henderson talking about the plans that she's got to convert the writings of Ted Cowan, which he did regularly in the Glenkens Gazette over, I'm not sure how many years, on matters historical. He was planning to use this material as the basis for a new history of the Glenkens, but of course that those plans were cut off in an untimely way. So Lizanne, Ted's widow and fellow historian, is reviving this drive to get this collated and put out there again. And I think all of us who read those stories will be looking forward to seeing what eventually comes out and gets published. So please welcome Lizanne.
Does this go straight on to the next? Does it go on straight on to the next PowerPoint? Do you know that?
Yeah, I think so. That's it.
Is it lined up? For
Yeah.
the next? Just hit it then again. I'll hit it again. Ta-da! Hooray. The technology has not failed me yet. There's time still. So, let me just get my timer, because if I don't stick to time, Mike Brown will have my head in a platter. So, I'm hoping most of you in the audience actually knew who Ted was. Otherwise, this will be a rather random talk for you if you don't. He held the chair of Scottish History and Literature at the University of Glasgow, and in my opinion, I am a little bit biased, was one of the best Scottish historians of his generation. One of the things that distinguished him from others was just the sheer breadth of his knowledge. Many aspects of Scottish history, everything dating back to some of the stuff we've just heard about from Adrian, going back to the Norse age, the Viking age, through to the medieval era of wars of independence, to the terrible impacts of the Stuart monarch James VI and his damaging policies against the Highlands, to the Covenanting era, and also the military leadership of Montrose. He wrote quite an important book on Montrose, to large-scale Scottish emigration in the 18th and 19th centuries, to the epic story of the 19th century Scottish Arctic explorers, which was the topic of his last publication, to traditional ballads, or the wartime poetry of Robert Service. I think you get the picture. He knew a lot of stuff. And that's just, there was a lot of other stuff in between. So his truly exceptional talents for academic research, inspirational teaching, and an absolutely enormous number of conferences and public speaking engagements set him apart from most other professional historians. And that is reflected in his many career achievements and prodigious output of publications. He had over 100 publications. And he's still got more to come, as we're about to hear. Another thing that set him apart from many others was not just his infectious passion for Scottish history. For, again, those of you in the room who did get a chance to hear him, you know what I'm talking about. But also his willingness to help others develop their interests. And despite the considerable demands of his job, gave very generously of his time to countless people and projects, an ability that to this day I am still in awe of and cannot begin to match. Ted and I moved to the Glenkens on a very warm day in June 2005, though we did have quite a few significant delays getting here. Some of the roads were closed. It doesn't really come as a surprise, I guess. On this occasion, it was the arrival of the 43rd President of the United States, George W. Bush, at Prestwick Airport. I was warned earlier not to mention the T word. And as a half Canadian, I find that very difficult to avoid at the moment. But honestly, I never thought we were going to see a dumber president than Bush until now. So that's all I will say on the matter. We previously lived in the West End of Glasgow, where Ted was head of the Scottish History Department there. I'd been working part-time in the History Department at Dundee. When in 2004, I got a full-time job at Glasgow's Crichton campus, so I did quite a lot of commuting in those days. A year later, in 2005, the role of director of the campus came up, and Ted was appointed to that role, hence our decision to leave Glasgow and kind of take our chances here in the wilds of Galloway. This was not really a part of Scotland that I personally knew all that well, but Ted did, having spent a lot of his teenage years in this area. He regularly hiked the hills of Dumfries and Galloway, all over Scotland really, in his youth. Ted never really thought he would get the opportunity to come back to this area, let alone to get the chance to work here. And in October 2009, he retired and was able to fill another life ambition, which was to settle down in one part of Scotland and really, get your teeth into that place's local history. So the Glenkens Gazette, as many of you will be aware, was established in November 2000 by Matthew Newton, the former proprietor of the village shop in Dalry, and Sarah Aid took over editorialship in 2006. Ted's first appearance in the Gazette was in issue 50 in 2009. Not one of his own local history articles, but actually a more subtle, subtle's not a word you would usually associate with Ted, but on this occasion I'll use it. A very small news item advertising a homecoming lecture series he put together, and he was contributing something on what he called New Galloway's most famous son, Robert Heron. He had been researching Heron and would eventually talk more about Heron in the Gazette, but also in a few academic publications as well. So Ted's very first segment in the Gazette, issue 51, 2009, taking up just a small quarter of the page, as you can see, not a full page yet. He hadn't quite got to those heady heights. Was on Robert Heron in the context of the 250th anniversary of the birth of Robert Burns. because Heron from New Galloway was the very first biographer of Robert Burns in 1797, but was later traduced and vilified by subsequent Burnsians, not happy about Robert Heron's candour when describing the great man. So in other words, that Burns was overfond of drink, women of pleasure, and the company of lowlives. He was a melancholic who squandered the money he made from his poems and proved a lousy farmer at Ellisland to boot, where Heron had actually visited him. So these home truths aside, Heron was in fact fascinated not only by Burns's alleged failings, but considered the bard a genius, as of course many people do. In Ted's estimation, Heron shared a certain affinity with Burns, both flawed individuals, we might say, but kindred spirits. Ted concluded in his article, when his detractors criticize him, they also condemn Burns. Ted would continue to defend Heron's worth in other Gazette articles and in a few academic journals as well. So his debut into the Gazette, it was quiet and initially small in word count. That would change as his historical segments started to grow in popularity and would, I believe, turn into quite a significant contribution to the history of the Glenkens. But he did not, of course, do this single-handedly. It is incumbent upon me to acknowledge the many other Gazette contributors who have also added valuable local history items over the years and continue to do so, playing their part in telling our story. People like Helen Bolton, Paul Goodwin, Bill Blythe, Anna Campbell, Avril Bridgman, the Reverend David Bartholomew, who's here today, and also Michael Ansell, who you've just heard from, among others. His second article skipped a couple of editions, appearing in issue 54. This time, this was the only time in 12 years that he missed submitting something, because he was still actually working in those days. This time he was given a half a page, so we're getting bigger, and was about another Robert, this time Robert Gordon of Lochinvar of Kenmure Castle, and the initiator of Scotland's first colonial scheme in 1622, when his ship sailed from Kirkcudbright to what is now Cape Breton on the east coast of Canada. This early Galloway imperialist wanted to call this new settlement New Galloway, but the project failed, so that name never stuck, and it would later become known as Nova Scotia, which, as I'm sure you know, actually means New Scotland. What Robert did manage was to produce an account of his colonial venture called The Encouragements in 1625, which in Ted's view, was a masterpiece of the literature of colonization. In issue 55, 2009-2010, Ted tackled the contentious issue of what exactly constitutes the Glenkens. I don't think we've really got to the bottom of that yet, but he did take a stab at it. What precisely is the extent of this district, and the intriguing fact that when the term first appeared in the historical record in 1275, Cross Michael was not included. I was kind of hoping John Nielsen was going to be here so I could wind him up about that, but he didn't turn up, so the joke is lost. By issue 59, Ted's local history feature was afforded a full page and a half. This was the largest ever received, and it was accompanied by a lovely colour photo taken by moi. That would happen in other editions as well. The topic for this notable expansion, was none other than local literary legend S.R. Crockett, the man whom Ted said had attempted to place Galloway on the literary map. Writing on the 150th anniversary of Crockett's birth, Ted's article posed the question, is Crockett worthy of celebration after a century and a half? Well, spoiler alert, yes, indeed he is. Though Crockett has been dismissed by some literary scholars as Kailyard, Ted said this dismissal is unfair, that Crockett deliberately experimented with different types of fiction and plot, that he wrote of heroes and troubled men of gutsy women and precocious children with sympathy, humour and respect. And in the process, conspicuously put Glenkens on the map like no one before him. He is our greatest writer who never forgot Galloway and who uniquely understood her people. Galloway should not forget him, is what he said in that piece. Well, a few years later, in 2014, Ted did his best to honour Crockett by organising a conference in New Galloway Town Hall. Then we had a dinner that evening at the Kenbridge Hotel, but there was a catch. For the dinner, we were asked to dress up in period costume, that's a picture of me, by the way, in 2014. You can see how haggard I've become in that time. I have a very vague memory, I can't remember the details now, of going with Ted to some dodgy warehouse somewhere on the edge of Glasgow to rent our costumes. It was all these old clothes that were usually rented out for film and TV, period dramas, that kind of thing. Well, it turned out that Ted didn't really enjoy getting dressed up at all. This is his sister patiently trying to attach his cravat, and he was just a big baby about it. He was making a big fuss. At the dinner, we had the lovely dinner at the Kenbridge. I sang a couple of Galloway-themed songs, such as the Galloway Hills. But at the conference itself, I did something a little bit different. In the weeks running up to the event, I'm not sure where Ted came up with this idea, but he asked me to present a poem at the conference. And I thought, okay, what is the poem? He says, it's written by Robert Louis Stevenson for S.R. Crockett. So that's the Crockett connection. And it was called My Heart Remembers How. Except he didn't want me to just read the poem, but he wanted me to put it to music. And I was like, what? So I've never done anything like that before in my life. But I accepted the challenge. It's not every day you get to co-write a song with Robert Louis Stevenson. So that is what I did, and I guess I'll sing it for you again right now, because it's not very often I get a chance to share this. Blows the wind today, and the sun and the rain are flying. Blows the wind on the moors today and now. Where about the graves of the martyrs the wops are crying? My heart remembers how. Grey recumbent tombs of the dead in desert places. Standing stones on the vacant wine-red moor. Hills of sheep and the house of the silent vanished races, and winds austere and pure. Be it granted me to behold you again and dying. Hills of home, and to hear again the call. Hear about the graves of the martyrs, the peewees crying, and hear no more at all. Blows the wind today, and the sun and the rain are flying. Blows the wind on the moors today and now. Where about the graves of the martyrs the wops are crying? My heart remembers how. My heart remembers how. My heart remembers how. Okay. Thank you. And you can see, this was the hall we had the conference in, but that's not me, clearly. That is Margaret Elphinstone, who was giving her presentation. Nobody took a picture of me doing my song, so that slightly irksome, but there you go. That's the way the cookie crumbles. So By issue 64, 2011, Ted's feature had been upgraded. Now he had a small headshot. But full disclosure, this picture was not taken here in the Glenkens. Not even in Scotland, as you can clearly see. There's a few clues there. It was one that I took of him on one of our many Arctic trips. We worked in the Arctic quite a bit at the town of Umanak in Greenland. There's no time, of course, today to go through, nor would it even be desirable to bore you to death with all of that, but all the historical topics that Ted covered in the Gazette. There's everything from the Viking era to the medieval romance of Fergus of Galloway, to the Cromwellian occupation, the Covenanters, the Glenkens Rising, to Robert Bruce, Robert Gordon of Lochinvar, Robert Burns, Robert Heron, he liked his Roberts, to industrial heritage such as the railways and the hydro scheme, to traditions around Christmas and Halloween, to woodlands and forestry. There's even a piece on the demise of the wonderful big copper beech, which used to stand at the foot of the Ken Bridge. For those of you who've lived here for a while, you'll remember it, which was sadly blown down during Boxing Day storms in 2013. Because we lived right across from the bridge, or I still live there, we actually heard this event, the tremendous crack of this iconic tree as it fell to her death. There's no time either to explain how some of the topics he worked on would feed into many of our Glenkens Story events. You've heard already from Mike about some of these. And here's a couple more. You've got the, what have we got here? We've got the Lowland Clearances talk here, which these two turkeys, by the way, do not acknowledge that Ted actually came up with the term lowland clearance. That was sort of accidentally missed out in their publication. To Robert Heron, yeah, we have to have that. To our Galloway event, our Gaelic and Galloway event, our Burns and Birds with Chris Rowley, Declaration of Arbroath, Vikings, yeah, lots of stuff to think back and with fond memories. So his impact it's truly immeasurable, often behind the scenes, supporting others. In issue 60, in 2010, for example, he picked up the story of John Rennie and the building of the Ken Bridge in 1820 to 21, at a time when, of course, canals were thought to be the future. And then, of course, the railways took over to become, the Ken Bridge becomes basically an important icon of Glenkens heritage, but should be, in Ted's view, be preserved for posterity. A decade later, we were both attending planning meetings for a series of events to commemorate the bridge. Ted returned to the topic, doing a lot more research into it, into the context of the bridge's construction, which he had hoped to speak about at this event, but regrettably Ted would not live to give that talk or even see the events that happened. So I'd like to take an opportunity to, huge shout out to John Crallan and all the amazing achievement that was. It was a truly unforgettable event. How Ted would have loved the night we lit up that bridge. It was accompanied with an opera singer and tons of happy people, and perhaps the most epic queue to the bar the Ken Bridge has ever seen, and some might think ever will see, because it's not quite as happening as it once was. It felt like we were in Naples, not New Galloway. It was just amazing. After 12 years, issue 127, that would be the last in which Ted would contribute an article. It was entitled An Early Christmas Present. Kind of ironic, I guess, because that was to be his worst Christmas ever, and certainly mine as well, having just received confirmation a couple of weeks earlier that he had lung cancer, and by New Year he died at home, as many of you know. Issue 128 would not have his usual article, but instead an obituary, which kindly noted Ted was a Scottish historian with an international reputation. He was also a champion of the history of Galloway and an ardent promoter of the Glenkens and its story. Praises continued in issue 129 with an appreciation from some of his friends, some who are here today, Mike Brown, Mike Ansell, David Bartholomew, Alan Smith, who's given his apologies, I want to thank you all for your kind words at this time. It meant a lot to me to read them. Though no doubt Ted would have found some way to make a joke out of it, what you all said. In issue 130, a piece by Jo Miller, who you'll hear from in just a moment, talked about Ted's various encouragements of her research into local music. Jo kindly stated in her piece that she had no doubt that Ted's contribution to the Glenkens and its folk will continue to make an impact in the years to come, including for myself, like for Jo. Not least because, in his own words, and here she's quoting from one of Ted's books, The People's Past, from 1980, folk tradition enables us to catch the echo of the people's past across the wide valleys of time. So just to sort of wrap some of this up, what next? Shortly before Ted died, he had been doing editorial work on Galway, Gaelic Lost Province. He would not see that in print, nor would he live to see his monograph, Northern Lights, on the Arctic Scots, the draft of which he managed to finish during the COVID lockdowns, but was left to me to see it through to completion. His next intended project, which he's also landed on my lap, thanks Ted, I really appreciate it, I really need the extra work. He had intended to produce a book called The Glenkens Story, largely but not exclusively structured around the articles in the Gazette. He wanted it to be accessible for any reader. He'd started to think about how he might arrange it. For example, should it be ordered chronologically or thematically? He hadn't quite made up his mind. He wanted to add new pieces as well to kind of connect the dots, so to speak, across the topics. And with his great capacity for creativity, he had the idea of starting the story off with the flight of an osprey. That's why there's an osprey painting here. It wasn't just shameless promotion of my painting. This idea of the osprey making its way up the Kendee Loch and River system. He was reading up on ospreys in the few months before he died, but for the life of me, I cannot remember exactly what his concept was. It's bugging me all the time. I find I cannot remember a great deal of things, which is apparently very common when you have widow brain or something. There's a word for it, I don't know what it is. See, I can't remember that either. So it's just evidence. But I do know that the first thing I painted after he died was a watercolor of an osprey. He wanted to have his written pieces accompanied by illustrations, in other words. So I feel quite strongly that the project should still go ahead, but I have not quite figured out either the details. Like Ted, I'm still thinking about what format this should now take. Should it be chronological? Should it be thematic? Or perhaps there's now a third option, which was helpfully suggested to me by Margaret Elphinstone, was to retain the stories in the order in which they appeared in the Glenkens, and never mind about trying to put them into any kind of an order. Perhaps some folks here will have other suggestions, so again, get your postcards out and write down your ideas. Whatever format it takes, it will, I hope, still retain Ted's incomparable blend of erudition and humour, his deep breadth of academic knowledge conveyed in an accessible tone, told with boundless enthusiasm and a great love of the lesser known and unexpected moments in Scotland's past. Just some very final remarks here in my last 1 minute. I'm keeping to time. I'm very much keeping to time. It's been quite a weird experience for me, this, talking about Ted in the past tense, now himself part of history. But I do find some solace in the fact that his legacy lives on in me, and in the many people's lives that he crossed, and in all of you for coming along today to support and to celebrate the Glenkens Story, sharing our history. Ted would have hated all the adulations and praise I have given him here today, because believe it or not, for those of you who knew him, he was actually incredibly modest. He hid that fact very well, but it's true. But he would have loved that we're all here today, together, 10 years later, discussing ways we can keep our local history alive and flourishing for the next generation. Here's to 10 more. Thank you very much. over yet. The best is yet to come. Now we have the wonderful Joe Miller, that's it, who is, again, a well-kent face to many of you here. She has a lot of expertise in local music traditions from the area. She's been working on ballad collectors and folk musicians since, what, the 1980s? 1980s? Yeah, so she knows her stuff. So, Joe, here you go.
Thanks. Thanks very much. It's a great pleasure to be here to share in celebrating the Glenkens Story's 10th anniversary. It's no small thing that they've done. Anyone who's been involved in community organisation and projects like this knows how much work it takes behind the scenes. So I'd like to say a personal thank you to Ted and Mike and Michael for all that they've done over this time, and encourage you to get involved in keeping it going. So I think I'm the light entertainment at the end of the day. And in this short talk, I'm going to share two musical examples that bring to life a nexus of people and places across the Glenkens from the 19th century and the early 20th century. The first describes some recent research into a very local song, and the second is a fiddle tune that illustrates a local aspect from my current project looking at the culture of fiddle playing across the whole Dumfries and Galloway region from the late 18th century to the early 20th century. So I thought we'd start with a song, and it's very local, called The Braes of Glenlee. How sweet is the valley where the Ken gently flows, where cowslips bud early, likewise the primrose. How sweet is the scene round each wide-spreading tree, where Phoebus shines bright on the braes o' Glenlee, where many a happy lang day I did spend on the banks and green braes o' the clear winding Ken. I then was as happy as a lamb on the lea, at the cairts and the plews on the braes o' Glenlee. The cairts, plews and harrows, I threw them all by, to cross the Tweed River my fortune to try. I'll trudge wi' a pack, selling draperies and tea, far, far fae the Shiel and the braes o' Glenlee. The Shiel and the Fintlock I now must include, and Gilbert's wee hamlet that stands in the wood, where many a lang day I hae roamed fu' o' glee, gathering nits on the braes o' Glenlee. Farewell to Craig Shinny, the Shaw and Craig Nell, and the hoose on the hill where old Sandy doth dwell. The brave hardy shepherds that live on the Dee, far away fae the green sunny braes o' Glenlee. Farewell to the steep rugged mountains o' Kells, where the blaeberry larks mang the sweet heather bells. Ye Galloway lassies o' every degree, I'll think on ye still, though I'm far fae Glenlee. Farewell to old Kiki and Sandy McGill, and brave Andy Dempster that works at the mill, including Lang Watty and General McGee. May they leave lang and happy on the braes o' Glenlee. Devonshire lassies are handsome and neat, and Somerset lassies are handsome and sweet, but dearer and sweeter by far unto me is my ain bonny lass on the braes o' Glenlee. So now, my dear lassie, whom I do adore, your red rosy cheeks I will never see more, by land or by water, in bondage or free, I'll think on ye still, though I'm far frae Glenlee. Farewell to my master, whose name it is Brown, a generous friend and a man o' renown. May good luck attend him where'er he may be, and his wealth still increase on the braes o' Glenlee. So now, my dear friends, I must finish my song, and it's now high time I was trudging along, with my pack on my back and a heart full o' glee. May ye leave lang and happy on the braes o' Glenlee. Now, one way of thinking about a song or a tune is as an artefact, an object from Galloway's musical hoard, perhaps. It invites questions, of course, such as who made it, who sang it or played it, where and when, how did it sound, and how might it be relevant today. I first heard the Braes of Glenlee when I was doing local fieldwork in the 1980s. And one of the key participants in this was a shepherd from the Forest Glen called Robbie Murray, who some of you may remember me speaking about at last year's conference, and his pictures in the exhibition in the cafe. And Robbie wrote down a lot of the songs that his father and brother had sung, as you can see here, in a diary, an old diary from 1980. And this is his first few verses of the Braes of Glenlee in a lovely cursive script there. And I want to play you a little bit of him singing it and me asking him about it. So listen to the way he sings it, listen to the kind of questions I'm asking and what he tells us about it.
How sweet is the valley where Ken gently flows, where cowslips burn early like wise the primrose. How sweet is the scene round its wide-spreading tree, where Phoebus shines bright on the braes o' Glenlee, where many a happy long day I did spend on the banks and green braes of the clear winding Ken. I then was as blithe as a lamb on the lea, at the Kirt and the Plews on the braes o' Glenlee. The Kirts, Plews and Harris, I threw them all by, to cross the Tweed River, my fortune to try. I trudged with my pack with draperies and tea, far, far frae the Shiel and the braes o' Glenlee. It's a great long song, great load of verses in it.
Do you ken it all to sing?
I ken it all, aye.
You going to sing it for us?
Oh no, I can't sing. Only everybody kens that tune. There's a lot of them kens the words now. Andy McClimate is the words, Jock Egger is the words, Davy Bell's wife is the words, Mrs. Watts, I don't know always the words. I've read it for money, everybody. If it all in my head, I ain't it written down, I'll tell you.
So from that we hear, first of all, that he doesn't consider himself a singer despite having just sung it. He took a lot of persuading to sing because in their day when they were alive, his brother and his father had been the singers in the family, but once they were gone, it was really important to him to keep their memory alive through writing down their songs. And as you can hear, he remembered all the words, but he also said he wasn't the only one who knew it. He said, he writ it out for money a buddy. And he mentioned Andy McClimate, the late Andy McClimate, who was a well-known singer, Mrs. Davy Bell in Dalry, Margaret Watson, of course, of the Forest Glen, and others. So he was also saying he'd never seen it in print, and that's significant here. So from that short exchange, I also learned the tune. And that's one reason for trying to persuade people to sing these things, because there are plenty of sets of lyrics written down, but it's great to hear the tune, and it's an Irish tune, which Robbie implied was very well known at the time. It's carried many songs. It's called the Irish Dragoons or the Enniskillen Dragoons. The other thing is how he sang it. So I'm interested not just in what people sang and played, but how it might have sounded, and this is much more difficult to capture. But what I got from him was a very matter-of-fact way of delivering a song like that. So he wasn't an expansive lyrical singer. It was a storytelling song with speech rhythms. So, as we heard, he copied it out for other folk. And the late Joe Bell remembered Robbie's brother Gil Murray singing this song, and he thought the author of it had probably been a ploughman at Glenlee. Robbie wrote down 3 versions of it, which I have the manuscripts for. They're all slightly different, but basically cover the same ground. And I've got another version in the hand of somebody called S. Byers, possibly the son of Adam Byers, who was at the farm of Overberskirch from the 1870s to the 1890s. So on the left here, I have collated the 3 versions of Robbie's text, and on the right, we've got Samuel Byers' version. And you can see from a quick glance that they cover the same kind of ground. Some of the lines are reproduced exactly, some of the lines are a little different. They include most of the same place names and names of people. The verses are in slightly different orders, but much of the same material is there. And of course, that's not surprising. If they were writing it out from memory, it would change in time. Now, Glenlee, of course, is in Kells Parish, just up the back of the village here, between New Galloway and Dalry, on this side of the River Ken. And there's also, of course, Glenlee Estate. And the songwriter is someone who is leaving the area. It's a farewell song, a praise song for all the people and places that he says he'll miss. And here's a list of all the people and places which the song mentioned. Some will be more recognisable than others. So we have the place names of the Shiel. Here, Shiel Farm, which of course is the home farm for Glenlee Estate, down in the middle right of the picture there. And then we have the Fintloch over here, that farm. And he also mentions in the song Craig Shinny, which then had a house and a shepherd in it, I think until at least the early 20th century. He mentions other places like Craignell, which are off the map over here, near Clattering Shaws. But of course, Clattering Shaws Loch wouldn't be there then, and there would have been a lot of coming and going across the hills. He mentions old Sandy, who worked in the mill. Now you can see that there's a mill up here. I think that's Glenlee Sawmill, but the Garach also had a mill, so it could have been one of those. And he mentions Waterside Farm, which is here, and Overberskirch, which was the home of, I think, the father of one of the people who wrote down the song, is just off the map here, but of course also in Kells. So, the Shaw is trickier. There's a hill down here, just the other side of Black Craig of Dee, called Shaw. And the song, of course, mentioned the brave, hardy shepherds that live on the Dee. So we have to think of a lot of coming and going across these hills. And I'll give you a sense of the time I'm thinking about that this song might have been made. Gilbert's wee hamlet that stands in the wood is harder to name or to find. It was maybe a source of nuts. Now, there might be a bit of poetic license here, gathering nuts in the wood, or maybe there were hazelnut bushes, and that might be another way of locating Gilbert's wee hamlet. He mentions, of course, the steep, rugged mountains of Kells. There are a number of men named in the song, and some are clearly nicknames, like Old Sandy, Auld Kiki, Lang Watty, and Jamie McGee, who Robbie's versions call General McGee. That might have been a nickname too. It's more challenging to identify who these were, and sometimes oral sources are the best source of information. Now, it might seem like too long ago, but it's surprising how much people remember if you ask around. And so there's a bit more work to do regarding the songwriters, a bit more to work with, rather, regarding the songwriter's master. Fortunately, he tells us, my master, whose name it was Brown. And he describes him in the song as a generous friend and a man of renown. I think this is someone who's called Oliphant Brown, who lived from 1822 to 1899. And he was the tenant of Shiel Farm on the Glenlee estate from as early as the 1850s until round about 1890. So he's listed in the valuation rolls as being at the Shiel and at Arry from the 1870s to 1890s. And as the song says, he was a man of renown. Perhaps a step up from just being a tenant. He's mentioned in one place as an overseer, so he might have been more like a factor. And contemporary newspaper reports show that he was, amongst other things, active in the Glenkens Agricultural Society. He was a member of Kells School Board. He played for the Kells curling team. Oliphant Brown, and Oliphant made him easier to find. Poor Oliphant Brown. It was a popular name at the time, but you wouldn't do it now maybe. He was a breeder of Clydesdale horses, and a very good one. He is regarded as having improved the local Clydesdale horse stock at the time. He was in demand as a judge at horse shows, not just in Dumfries and Galloway, but also in Ayrshire and Glasgow. And on his retirement in 1891, he went to live in Dalry, and he received a presentation from the Glenkens, Parton and Balmagee District Entire Horse Society. So they really valued his expertise and his judgment. So I think that's who the master in the song was. Can we identify who made the song, who worked for Brown? According to Joe Bell, who I spoke to in the 80s, he thought he was probably a ploughman at the Shield. And you might remember there was a line in the song that said, the kerts, ploughs and harrows, I'll put them all by. So that suggests to me he wasn't a shepherd, but someone who was more likely to be a ploughman. And the names of seasonal workers in those sort of jobs can be harder to pin down, since they moved from job to job with the farming term. Although, however, several ploughmen from the Shield are named in contemporary accounts of ploughing matches in the paper. So there might be some more clues there. He loved the Braes of Glenlee, or he seems to love it, so why was he leaving? Well, he was going off to be a packman. You'll remember he was talking about trudging with his pack, carrying drapery and tea. Another name for it would be a travelling salesman, or when I was growing up, it was called a door-to-door salesman. In the second half of the 19th century, demand for drapery and clothing grew markedly, and operating from urban shops or warehouses, packmen were dispatched to canvass door to door for buyers who'd pay in weekly instalments. So many Scots did this job in England and Wales that Scotch packmen became a generic term for all such salesmen. And other young men from the Glenkens also went to the pack. Members of the Milligan family of Balmagee, for example, went to Bradford in the early 1800s as packmen, where they eventually settled and established a successful business. And George Murray, who grew up at Moorbrock in the Kersfairn Hills and was the son of Thomas Murray, his father, who's better known as a poet, wrote a poem about becoming a packman, which also circulated as a song and is still known today. However, George Murray didn't make a success of this. You might have heard the song. It goes, I'm a pear shepherd laddie and Murray by name. To be a Scotch packman to Grimsby I came. I left my old father and mither and all, my leal-hearted cronies in wild Galloway. And he has a line that says, at herding or ploughing, though pair are your foe, you'll wish you were safe back in wild Galloway. So he turns his back. He says he was chased away, and there is evidence that there was actually a bit of racism against packmen, particularly people from a Scottish or Irish background at this time. So that's a taste of how a song like this can be a real repository of all sorts of interesting information. And further research might yield more, but from what I've found, it seems likely that the song was made in the late 19th century, possibly any time between the 1870s to 90s, by someone who worked at the Shield in Glenlee while Oliphant Brown was there. As I said, it doesn't seem to have been printed or published, but circulated orally or in handwritten versions well into the 20th century. Turning now to fiddling in the Glenkens during this period. To give you an overview of the kind of research I'm doing just now, I'm looking with a colleague at the whole culture of fiddle playing across the region during this time, which is a much neglected topic. When people think of Scottish fiddling, they don't tend to think of Dumfries and Galloway, but we are finding, surprise, surprise, there has been a very diverse, a very rich and a very active culture of fiddle playing here, with people not only playing the instrument but making them, teaching them, serving their communities, and we have come up with a rough categorisation of the kind of fiddlers during the 19th century as including a small number of professionals who made their entire living this way and were mainly based in towns. Then a group of semi-professional people who were perhaps supplementing their main income with some music. And then the largest group were local fiddlers, many of them self-taught, playing for their families and their own communities. And communities, of course, are often bound together by shared work. And a good example of this in the Glenkens was the life of the herding community in the 19th century up to the end of World War II, which, of course, Robbie Murray and his parents and his friends had been part of. And music played a very significant part in the lives of individuals and at social occasions, with the fiddle a very common instrument. And one of these was Will Kirk, whose dates are 1871 to 1951. And you can see a picture in the exhibition out there of his two daughters, Peggy and Jean Kirk, who I spent a lot of time with. And it was they who gave me a manuscript from the 18th century that had been made in Gatehouse of fiddle tunes, which I played from at the or rather Amy played for us at the conference last year. And Peggy and Jean became their father's accompanists and travelled with him to all sorts of dances and things he played at. He taught pupils for free, and he played regularly at dances, mostly in small schools and halls outside of the villages. Contemporary reports in the press paint a picture of these occasions, and you can see one here. This was an event in aid of curling club funds, curling, of course, being a very important sport at the time. And it started with a concert. And what's interesting to me about this is it's in the Ayr Advertiser. So it's not a local paper, but if you know Kersfairn and that area, you know it always had comings and goings with Ayrshire across the border there. The performers at the concert were a mixture of local musicians and guest singers from Ayr and Glasgow, so there were some stars there, some celebrities, but also local people. And they had songs, readings, piano solos, light classical pieces and violins. But let's home in on what happened after the concert, because often these events were also very interesting. And this author from the Ayr Advertiser remarks on the assembly which followed, and in the language of the day, the youth and beauty of the district tripped on the light, fantastic toe, to the strains of the violin to an early hour the next morning. And he's struck by the fact that one feature of the assembly was the evident culture of the calisthenic art. In other words, they were good dancers. And for my purposes, this is most interesting, the remarkable number of gentlemen, young and old, who not only could, but actually did take their turn at supplying the music, which was excellent. And he thinks that Kersfairn is striking in this respect, because for such a small, relatively small, scattered population, there were so many fiddle players. Now, the venues for such occasions were often the small schools, as I've mentioned. And we know that in 1897, Will Kirk played at a dance at Corsglass School. And that school, of course, was very long-lasting, one of, I think, 21 rural schools in the Glenkens over quite a lot of years. And this one lasted from 1804 to 1925, just off the back road between Dalry and Kersfairn on the way up to Lochinvar. The school first gets a mention in the 1844 contribution to the new statistical account for Dalry, and at that time there were 12 pupils at the school, and the highest recorded number was 48. And of course, there we are, that's the ruin that it is today, and that was taken a few years ago because the sign blew away in a storm. The sign saying that this was the remains of Corsglass School and that it was a monument, and exhorting people not to rob it for stones. And on the right hand there is a sort of pencil sketch, which I'll explain in a minute. So the account of this event in 1897 in the Dumfries and Galloway Standard says, the annual Shepherd's Ball was held at Corsglass Schoolroom on Friday evening, when upwards of 30 couples engaged in dancing to music. Imagine 30 couples in there, supplied by Mr. Macmillan, assisted by Mr. W. Kirk, until a late hour on Saturday morning. And these dances did go on awful late. I remember Peggy Hutchison, Peggy Kirk, telling me that she once cycled with her father to one of these dances, him presumably with his fiddle on his back. They cycled, played the dance, and came home to Bogue, where they stayed for many years. And he said to her, "It's not worth going to bed. We'll just talk about the dance, have a cup of tea, and then we'll get away to our work." So they didn't even get to their beds. I have to say, I don't know, any of you who are musicians will realise not much has changed. I remember talking to Andrew Mellor, who's here, once about the late hour that these dances seemed to go on to, and we agreed that they must all have been a lot younger than us. Now, I'll play a tune in a moment, but I just want to finish by saying I've talked about an awful lot of men here, apart from Peggy and Jean. So where are the women in these stories? It's a glaring omission from many of the accounts I've referred to, for example, press accounts. I've no doubt that Oliphant Brown's wife was active in her own right, but it's not unusual in that period to find wives referred to mostly in relation to their husbands. Even when she gives birth to their sons, she's just Mrs. Oliphant Brown. Unless, of course, they were of the upper classes, in which case you're more likely to be named. Women were, of course, doing plenty, not just in a domestic context, though that shouldn't be minimised, but also in civic society. And there's a pressing need to highlight the parts played by women in local history. In case you didn't know, we can squeeze it in just in time. March is Women's History Month. So in this connection, I want to mention my friend, my old school friend, Jennifer Harvey of Dalry. And for 2 years, she has had a project to get a new sign made for Corsglass, what's left of Corsglass School here. Identifying the landowner, raising money, designing, ordering and installing a new sign, and I think it's just being made just now. Why is this important? I asked her yesterday. These places have not only been sites of young people's education over many years, but also, as we've seen, venues for the whole community, especially in scattered rural locations. And Jennifer, who's worked in the education service here for many years, feels that it matters that people know these historical locations and the role they've played in local communities. And although the building is a ruin, the trees that are still standing there were planted by Corsglass school children in 1917. Now I'm going to end with a tune called Old Victoria. Now, as you can imagine, there are many tunes and many dances with Victoria or Victorian in them. And Will Kirk did read music and wrote down music from his own repertoire, and so this is from his own collection, his own music manuscript collection, which was passed to me by his family. But I've chosen to play it because it was also played by Robbie Murray. So this was a tune that was in circulation and might well have been played for one of the dances in somewhere like Corsglass Schoolroom. And I'm going to play it in the way that Robbie would have played it, with dancing in mind. And I'm also going to play it on his fiddle, because when he died, I was very lucky to inherit one or two things from the house in memory of the time I'd spent with him, thanks to Margaret Watson and her family. So here we are, Robbie's long gone, but we still have his fiddle, we still have the tune, and we can remember these people. Thank you very much. There is more than enough room for a waltz down here. It's a very short little tune, and it would have been part of a longer set.
So we're getting towards the end now. It's up to me now to try to look forward and think about where we take the Glenkens story on its next stage. Joe, where was that? What was that Gilbert reference you talked about? Gilbert's
wee hamlet that stands in the wood.
That was a great example of intangible cultural heritage we've just been listening to. The sort of detective work that Joe's been doing to tease out the evidence from that one song is fantastic, and the amount of information that's in that one document is incredible. I wonder whether that was a bit of a play on Craig Gilbert, the former farm at the back end of Cairnsmore of Dee. Might be. Anyway, be that as it may, possibilities for the future. So, as Mike Brune said earlier, there's no shortage of ideas really, and we could have spent a long time going over possibilities for the future here, but just in a few minutes I want to flag up some things that may be taken forward by the group in the time to come. So we're really talking about cultural heritage projects here and project suggestions, and the way people tend to talk about these things are splitting them into what they call tangible cultural heritage and intangible. And I think Joe's largely been talking about the stuff on the right here in the session earlier, but with a bit of tangible stuff mixed in there. Corsglass School is an obvious example of that. But that tends to be the way that people look at these different categories of our cultural heritage. And thinking about these in turn, we're just going to flag up a few possibilities here. If we think about the tangible side of things we can touch, again, there's our area is so rich, we're replete with possibilities here, so I can only touch on a few examples of potential future events, potential future topics for exploration, study, and potential publication even. But if we take archaeology, we've heard about the Galloway Hoard here. We'll claim that Balmagee's in the Glenkens at the moment. I'm not quite sure if that's true or not, but I think for the purposes today. Craig and Cally is an interesting one. Again, I'll just pick on a few examples here, but Craig and Cally is Crec na Callieche, the rock of the old hag. And there's a local story that some of you may know that Robert Bruce, in his at his lowest ebb, turned up at Craig and Cally. It's up near Clattering Shaws, for those who don't know where it is. And when he was at his lowest ebb, he was given succour by the good wife of Craig and Cally, and her three sons by three different fathers. Ended up in his army, and the next day he went across and he defeated the English at Moss Raploch, and that was his start going up. Now, why am I saying all this detail about this? Well, Professor Willie Gillies has written a paper about how this story and the place name here represents an example of a very early Gaelic sovereignty myth that can be traced back to Old Irish literature in Ireland and to some extent in Scotland. And the fascinating thing is that the Glenkens actually possesses two of these things. One is Craig and Cally. The other example of the same genre and the same early Gaelic sovereignty story is the same Brucean story but applied to Polmadie Mill and the miller's wife there. So this whole thing is redolent with promise. We could have a whole event around Craig and Cally. Bruce's, or the actual house at Craig and Cally is not the house that's being restored now, but just to the front now. It's neglected. It's kind of covered in broken down bits of Sitka spruce. There's a project there to map it, to find out where it is, to potentially even excavate it, because I think the house that the Cailleach lived in is probably still findable there. Anyway, that's a couple of things on that type of archaeology. Tower houses, we've got a rich clutch, if I put it that way, of tower houses here. We haven't had a talk specifically on the Glenkens tower houses. We've had talks on Barholm Castle restoration and such like. Moats, Balmaclellan, Dorai, these are mysterious places, mysterious monuments. Nobody really knows who built these moats. Mills, the power of the power of the glens before they were harnessed to the modern hydropower. They were giving hydropower all through the medieval period. These are just two examples at Grennan and Palmady. Hill forts, Carstfairn Heritage Initiative are looking to undertake or have an archaeological excavation undertaken at Strunfreggan Hill Fort, a very enigmatic monument up in Carstfairn. Standing stones. Mike showed a picture of the Kilterson Celtic crosses earlier in his talk, and there's plenty of material of that type. Of a slightly different collection of tangible cultural heritage ideas, we could do more, I think, on the native woodland history, the native woodlands at Garach. I don't know if any of you have been to the native woodland remnants at Gordonson, wonderful places. Mike or somebody else mentioned the history of the Galloway Hydro, that's very interesting. The canals were also mentioned. Someone mentioned the canals. That one time it was mooted that Dalry would be connected by canal to Castle Douglas. Climate and vegetation history, we've had a little bit of that from Richard Tipping in the past, but much more could be done there. Farming, revolutionised over the last 50 years. You know, when I was a kid at Dalry School, Newfield was a dairy farm, mixed dairy farm. You don't really see dairy cattle here. The whole area has been afforested. How many farms have succumbed to forestation and are lying there waiting to be rediscovered? I think we have had something on peat bogs, or maybe that was the thing that Maz Smith has been organising. Intangible cultural heritage, some ideas. We've just talked about music in the Glenkens, and I think there's fantastic. That was a fantastic example of the type of work that can be done. Lost farms, I mentioned earlier, but there's a tremendous amount could be done there. I remember when we first came to Braidnoch in Carstfairn Parish, there was a ruin of a farm called, Upper Palmady, I think, just across from Braidnoch, and it was still discernible. But after the first harvest and the second rotation, it's completely gone. The forestry activity destroyed it completely. You saw an example there of our attempts to hold a bit of at least part of a conference in the local Scots dialect. That was fun, but I think that what we have there is a piece of cultural heritage that in a way is disappearing. You don't hear the local Scots spoken in the way that was prevalent when I was growing up in this area, and I think there's a lot we could do to capture that before it's lost forever. Field names is a particularly rich source of potential information. We did a project down at Borg. Actually, Ted Cowan and myself went down and initiated that. We did a talk and happened to mention field names, and they took it up and ran with it. And they, over a couple of years, recorded 1,000 field names, hitherto not written down. And amongst those field names were some names that date back 1,000 years. So imagine the history of an area, and I'm sure there'll be some like that in the Glenkens, that can be uncovered if you find that there's a name of a field that goes back to the Brittonic-speaking era or the Norse-speaking era, and there were several examples of that in Borg. Glenkens artists, I see we've got another one here in Lizanne. Earlier, I didn't realise you were an artist of that renown there. But, there's a whole series of things we could investigate and potentially stage around Glenkens artists. An oral tradition, the musical tradition, the stories, the Palmadi miller's wife, the good wife of Craig and Callie being just two examples. There's other stuff out there that we need to collect and we could talk about and have events around. However, as Mike alluded to earlier, the Glenkens story started off with quite a healthy number of people sort of driving it forward. It rather dwindled a bit over time until it was largely just David, Mike, myself, and the redoubtable Ted until he passed away. So none of us are getting any younger, really. So we need to get some new blood, I think, and some new ideas. And what I've discussed, I keep flicking that accidentally. What I discussed earlier shouldn't be taken. Here's the Bible. We're going to do this. They're just suggestions. But you will have your own ideas, and please feel very much welcome to join this group and put your name down on the list that Mike was talking to, wherever he's got the bit of paper. You'd be very welcome to come to a meeting on the 27th of April, I think it is, to discuss how we can take this fantastic, rich heritage we've got here further. And I was going to do this talk by reference to pictures of all the various bits of cultural heritage we've got around the area, but I realised that would be an afternoon in itself. But when I was doing it, I came across this picture painting. I thought I'd just leave it up there to ask if any of you know where it is. And it's, again, another example of intangible cultural heritage that I never knew about existed. And this is apparently in Castle Douglas. I'm not sure if it's in Town Hall. It's a council-owned thing by an artist called Harry Hewitt. And it's called Glenkens Snows. And I kind of pride myself in knowing the area quite well and being able to recognise the various sceneries, but I've no idea where this is at all. As Mike Brown said earlier, that now could be under a reservoir, potentially, or it could be a conifer forest. But if anybody knows where that is, it looks so scenic, I feel I should know where it is. But it's completely unknown. And with that, I'll finish. Thank you.
Well, that's the story. Thank you all very much for coming out and showing such interest. Thanks very much to our astonishingly interesting and entertaining speakers, Adrian, to Lizanne, and to Joe. Thank you very much. It's been quite an afternoon. I think we should thank the staff and volunteers of Catstrand who put on a very good show for us, and to Bruce on sound and engineering. That's excellent. Thank you. I'd like to mention the financial support we received from the Glenkens Community Shop. That's the charity shop in Dalry. It's well worth supporting if you want to be well dressed. That's where you go. And a final word on where are the Glenkens. I like to think of the Glenkens as being not so much a geographical entity as a state of mind. So let's maintain that. And there is so much energy, excitement, and enjoyment in what's going on. Let's try and continue it. Please sign up to maintain this interest. There's a board on the piano outside. Do come along on the 27th of April and share in helping us to continue this story. Thank you very much indeed.